Hey, welcome to my channel. My name is Frankie. I use they, he pronouns. If you're new here, hi. I used to talk about horror on the internet quite a bit, and now I'm making a pivot into Christo-fascists, which is not that different. I recorded a video on Saturday, and it's now Tuesday. And I haven't been able to edit it. And I think some of why I haven't been able to edit it is because I just know that I can say the things I want to say better. Especially if I'm not focused on the thing I was focused on. I do want to learn more and talk about Douglas Wilson. Because fuck that guy. I actually want to take a step back and talk about some things that I very briefly skimmed over in the Lil Tay video. Because you're hearing me say I'm pivoting to talk about Christo-fascists, but you might remember, if you're paying any attention to me, that when I first came back last week, the first video I did was about Lil Tay. And that was just because it was an in to talk about adultism. And I think that if I just take a second and talk specifically about adultism and unpack my perspective on this concept, that I can always point back to it and be like, see, it's that again. It's that again. And I might have to make a few videos like this where I first build up the concepts and then talk about the current events and then just be able to point back and be like, that thing, I made the touchstone for that, because that's kind of how my brain works. And so the reason that adultism came up for me, and I will define myself, just give me a minute, but the reason that adultism came up for me in the Douglas Wilson conversation is because there was a point where they're interviewing, because he is a head pastor of a big church in Idaho, and he's also Pete Hegseth's boyfriend. I'm using that tongue-in-cheek. I can be homophobic because I'm a homo, so it's fine. Gay on gay crime. They talked to his sub-pastors. I don't really understand church hierarchy very well, but they talked to the pastors underneath, and they all were basically like, we should repeal the 19th Amendment. Women shouldn't be able to vote. It should be a right for households, and it should be a thing that's discussed amongst the household. And that was interesting to me because they're defining a household very nuclearly, and so they're trying to say that the woman is on par with the children without actually saying it, and that on par, importantly, is beneath the man. Adultism. Adultism is the axis of child oppression. It's the idea that adults are particularly more human than children. And I think that it's a little hard of a subject to pull people in on and get them to buy in on as being worthwhile, and not just being well, we have to protect children from themselves. First of all, I want to talk about Michael Omi and Howard Winott. Not as people. I don't know anything about them as people. One of the first things that I read when I went off to 4-year was a couple of chapters from their book, Race Formation in the United States. These chapters talk about, it's almost so I see Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality as talking about it's still sociological, but it's the experiential level, right? We're talking about how being a white queer person shows up in my life, right? And how it's not just that I'm white, it's not just that I'm queer, it's that I'm white and queer. That results in a different identity and a different set of experiences than if I was a black queer or a white straight person, or white and cis. Omi and Winott basically say it's not just that. It's not just that at the human level, the discriminations come together to make a unique discrimination in people's lives. It's that when you have these concepts, the categories create each other and are interreliant on each other existing in order to work. They basically create and reify each other as broad concepts, right? And then you can see that play out on the individual level. So I think that the one I always use as the first example, because people already kind of know what you're talking about, is black women and Asian men. Because black women aren't fully afforded womanhood, and that's because we masculinize blackness. And then kind of the inverse for Asian men. Daniel Day Kim, he just did an interview like in the last week talking about how he's been acting for 30 years. He had his romance scene, or his romance subplot, sorry, in Lost, but he's never been a romantic lead. And it's like something he wants out of his career is to be a romantic lead. And Asian men aren't given opportunities in Hollywood like romantic leads because they're not seen as real men, because we feminize Asianness. And so race is gendered and gender is racialized. Relevant to this conversation, or at least what was relevant to when I was talking about Lil Tay, because what I was seeing online in a lot of that conversation, and anytime like the sexuality of like an 18 to 23-year-old comes up, or an age gap relationship comes up, you got to hear about fucking the prefrontal cortex. There's definitely a way that like disability is infantilized and childhood is disabled or coded as disabled. Unlike the racial categorizations that I just went into before, where there's like no real basis in reality for that. It's all racism. There is an element of reality, measurable, to seeing childhood as a kind of disability. You do have things that you have limited capabilities of that you grow into as you age. You're not gonna give birth to somebody and then they're gonna be able to be an adult, because we're not deer, right? So like you're not gonna give an infant a job in taxes. But the thing that jumped out to me with them talking about wanting to get rid of the 19th Amendment is now gender is also infantilized. And childhood is also sexed. Once you have Omi and Wanat's model, once you've really grasped it, at least for me, I have not stopped seeing it. I see it all the time. And it's just like, oh, once again, oh, those things are forming each other again. Oh, those things are creating each other again. But why does it matter? Right? What does it tangibly matter? I mean, first of all, they're trying to make women a subset of children so that they can take away their right to vote, which is bad. I watched this video on TikTok just this morning by Mama Mephistopheles. Did I do it? And she talks about Will Hoyt's Law. And Will Hoyt's Law is the principle that basically conservatives are just operating with one rule. They're acting like their worldview is far more complex, but they are really only invested in one thing. Their whole thing is underpinned by one point, which is that you should have in-groups who the law protects but does not bind. And then you should have out-groups who the law binds but does not protect. All with an implication that the cruelty of such a thing is on purpose. What I'm trying to say is that the eventual goal of Christo-fascists, arguably of the conservative movement as a whole, global paternalism, it is about making as many people children as possible. Because think of how we structure childhood. You have a lot of expectations put on you. You have a lot of rules put on you. You are constantly going through education and indoctrination and the shaping of yourself, often with very little autonomy. And we're kind of hitting a wall on it because we're learning like, oh, like children need autonomy time or else they can't really be functional adults. They need it for their brain development. We sure do want to limit that time. And that time is getting smaller and smaller as the demands put on parents are getting larger and larger. I say this as someone who has done 2 stints as an after-school teacher. Yeah, when you witness like 10-year-olds going through burnout, that fucks you up. That changes your relationship to society. When you're watching children do 12-hour days, 4 or 5 days a week, 12-hour days that you're not even doing because you're going home in the middle between the preschool, the before school shift and the after school shift. Yeah, even you're more protected as like a minimum wage, barely qualified employee than the child is, who is assumed to just be resilient or worse, poor, so who cares? You might be thinking to yourself though, but children do have protections because we have CPS. Sure, there are lots of criticisms of CPS, but surely nobody's trying to get rid of CPS. People only want to improve CPS, right? Right? See, there's this thing called the parents' rights movement. Now, people individually may talk about parents' rights. That does not necessarily mean that they're part of the parents' rights movement. The parents' rights movement, the expression that I am particularly familiar with because I am an avid listener of Nobody Should Believe Me, which is a podcast about medical child abuse, also known as Munchausen by proxy. Basically, the parents' rights movement feels that it's government overreach that they've been told that they shouldn't abuse their children, that the government is setting boundaries on their ability to corporally punish their children, or even just outright abuse their children. And in particular, you get a lot of people that are really angry that, like, child abuse medicine exists. And they think that, like, basically because you have a bunch of people that are looking for medical child abuse, that they're basically operating in the world with a hammer, only seeing nails. Pediatricians with specialties in child abuse are less likely to diagnose and report child abuse than the general population, because they actually know what they're looking for and they understand the severity. But you also have to realize that at the very least a subsect of the parents' rights movement is a bunch of people who argue that shaken baby syndrome isn't real, that it's not real, that it's a medical conspiracy. Shaken baby syndrome. The types of people that are very invested in parents' rights movements, they see themselves as the in-group that should be protected and not bound. They should have unconditional access to the out-group that is their children. And then they should be able to abuse that child and neglect that child and fuck with that child as much or as little as they, in their abuser brain, deem necessary. And that the child should in fact have as many limitations as possible from leaving. And I think with Christo-fascists, because there are a lot of overlaps in these groups, I think that that's the core of Christo-fascists. I really do. I think that they are so attached to the fucking nuclear family because that's the hammer that they walk in the world with. And they see people existing without needing their validation or approval or permission as nails. Thank you for watching. Hopefully this makes at least 80% sense. That would be great. If you want to see how this ties in more and more to, you know, the hellscape we live in, please subscribe, please comment, please like, please, just all those things and other things. I'm trying to get back into the swing of this. I'm trying to find my rhythm. I really would like to do like as close to daily of content as possible. Have a big ego and a big dick for a second. I kind of know in the abstract that like what I have to say and the way I'm viewing things and the way I'm connecting things is important and helpful. But then I get into the sauce of trying to make this kind of stuff, and I start to wonder if like having thoughts is anything at all. Even though the data in my life suggests that yes. Positive encouragement would help me a lot. Okay, thanks. Here's a cat. I like picking her up upside down even though it makes her mad. Yep. There you go. Okay, bye.